So Camilla.
Thank you. Well, I'm very, very delighted to be able to speak to you today about Article 19, which, alongside Article 12, I think is one of the most important rights of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Just to give you a quick overview of the session, first of all, what I'm going to do is talk about what I mean when I talk about the right to...
You don't have to.
Okay, that's fine. Oh, okay, thank you. What I mean by the right to community living, and why I think that is such an important right for all of us. Then I'm going to give an overview of Article 19 itself, and then look at issues relating to its implementation. But first of all, just a couple of points before I start. One of the things I thought is worth mentioning to you is that much of my presentation is based on the work that I've been involved in Eastern and Central Europe and the former Soviet Union, which is to raise the serious concern that thousands, in fact, just over, as estimated, over 1.2 million people are placed in institutions across Europe. So if you think about the former Soviet Union, that number is increased dramatically. So there are many, many people in the 21st century who are still placed in institutions. And so I've been involved in work that's really trying to promote community, the right to community living, and advocate for governments to introduce legislation and policies that ensure the transition from institutional care to community-based services and support for people with disabilities. And clearly, Article 19 is a very important tool in our advocacy work. And so I will be talking a little bit about some of the ideas about what government should be doing in order to implement Article 19 in countries where still the predominant form of care, or perhaps actually the only form of care, is placement in institutions. And that's often for life. The second sort of general comment I wanted to make was really reflecting on the discussions that we had yesterday in Michael's presentation and the discussions afterwards. And again, I think it shows for me that not only are Article 12 and 19 very closely linked, but there are also some very common themes, I think, arising from the analysis of what these rights actually mean to us. First of all, I think they introduce concepts that challenge the traditional way of thinking. So we have to ask ourselves what they mean and really be willing to sort of engage in discussion around what we think these articles mean and what we should be doing to implement them. And that then brings us the realization that we might not be able to get to where we want to go immediately. But what we do need to ensure is that we're moving in the right direction and that we are constantly reviewing our progress in how we are going to be meeting these goals. And the other very important issue that occurred to me from yesterday is that we need to keep talking to each other. No one has all the answers. And what we need to be doing is we need to be asking more questions of each other, so we're going to be better able to articulate what we're trying to achieve and how we need to do that. So that really brings me back to Andrew's comment, but please do feel free to ask questions at any time during my presentation. We've then got opportunities for discussion, and we've got some exercises to look at if we kind of run out of things to say and want to have a look at something more specific. Okay, so moving on. Oh, I've managed to get rid of that entirely. So first of all, the right to community living, what it means and why it matters. So a little diagram for you. What this shows, I hope, is there we all are in the middle, and thinking about what things matter to us as people who've got friends, relations. We want to have a life that we do the things we want to do, we want to have aspirations and hopefully meet those. So here's just a few examples of the things that I think are important to us. These are just some of the things I've come up with, but we could add more to that and have a discussion around that if we wanted to. But it seems to me that education, healthcare, occupation, leisure, social support, and civil engagement and housing, these are all really, really crucial aspects of everyone's life. And these are points that are encapsulated in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. But it's also something I think is really important to think about when thinking about the right to community living. Article 19, the right to live independently and participate in the community. It's about enabling people to engage in community life. And that's something that many people take for granted, but for others, particularly those who are placed in institutions, do not have. So that's really, I think, why I think community living is something that matters to all of us, but for some people, they do not have the opportunity to engage in community life. Community living is a concept that I think is perhaps quite a European basis. In the UK, we talk much more about independent living, but I think to some extent they are much at the same point. And I've just got here for you a description of community living by the European Coalition for Community Living. And you'll see it says, people with disabilities are able to live in their local communities as equal citizens, with the support that they need to participate in everyday life. This includes living in their own homes or with their families, going to work, going to school, and taking part in community activities. Not really, much to ask for in many ways. I mean, this is something, as I said, that many people take for granted. When we look at community living, I think sometimes, particularly when we're talking about the issue I mentioned earlier, which is about people being placed in institutions, we tend sometimes to focus very much on where the person lives. And while that is important, particularly when you think about people who are not able to exercise their right to community living, those placed in institutions are segregated from the community, there is something additional to this right. It's about being considered and respected as a human being, having the opportunities that everybody else have. So that's where you come to the vision, which is looking at ensuring that people with disabilities have the right to live and participate in the community as equal citizens. So it's just not just about the physical location of where somebody is, but it's this really important aspect of enabling people to live and participate in the community alongside their fellow citizens. Just a little bit more about this concept of community living and independent living. So we talked about the fact that it's people having the same choice and control and freedom as everybody else. And that comes through in terms of home, being at work, and having members of the community. But I think there's sometimes there's a confusion, and particularly when we're talking about the term independent living, because it's not about people just being on their own. It's about people being in the community and being supported in the community. And that's a really crucial aspect of independent living and community living. It's providing people with the support that would enable them to engage in community life. An additional key aspect of this is that the assistance and support are those that the individual chooses and are there to enable that person to meet his or her own aspirations. It's not things done to somebody, it's that person saying what is going to help them to live their lives as they want to live it. So moving from that to something that a colleague and friend of mine, John Evans, who's a great campaigner in the UK and has also done a huge amount of work on a European level, He was asked at an inquiry that was set up by the Joint Committee on Human Rights in the UK, the Westminster Parliament, looking at independent living. It was particularly concerned about the impact of the recession on people with disabilities in the UK, looking, for example, at the welfare benefits reforms and thinking about whether that was creating a problem in the sense of was it enabling independent living, or was that beginning to be restricting people living independently? So it's a very important inquiry, and John Evans was asked to give evidence at that inquiry. And I'll just read this out to you because I think it is very, very important and I think pretty moving as well. He said, in response to the question, what does independent living mean to me? He said, I think that that is a very deep, life-changing question, and it means a lot of things. I suppose I could say it has changed my life, and I know it has changed the lives of many other disabled people whom I have come into contact with. It is very hard, I think, to get that message across to people who perhaps are not dependent on others to support them in their day-to-day living. But it has provided me with a life, my work. I have worked widely, and the opportunities and the choices to do the things I want to do, like you do. I think with the restrictions someone like myself has, with the kind of severe impairment I have, it is freedom. It is the freedom for me to be able to do what I want to do, when I want to do it, in a way because I have people around me who can support me to do that. So that was John's definition of independent living. But I think it's something that really does encapsulate what we're trying to achieve. So moving on to Article 19, which encapsulates this right to community living. So it provides the equal right of disabled people to live in the community with choices equal to others. And it requires states to take effective and appropriate measures to facilitate disabled people's, first of all, full enjoyment of this right, and then full inclusion and participation in the community. And again, it's just worth, reflecting on that. It's not simply about where the person lives. This right is about enabling people to engage in community life. And then it goes on to sort of set out sort of three main areas in which states will be required to focus on. The first is that everyone has the equal opportunity to choose where and with whom to live. The second is that states need to ensure that there are a range of community support services that are available to people with disabilities. And the third area is to ensure equal access to mainstream services. So it's not just about services for people with disabilities. Article 19 is saying that people with disabilities have a right to take part and receive services that are for the general public. But those services will then need to be arranged so that they are responsive to the particular needs of people with disabilities. So you can see it's a very, very broad right, and the expectation on states are that they look at how they achieve these rights, and we'll see later on what I think states will need to do in order to meet these obligations. The other aspect of Article 19, we've talked a little bit about its connection with Article 12, and one of the reasons why Article 12 is so important to Article 19 is because this is going back to this choice of living arrangements. So you can see that if people have their ability to make decisions for themselves taken away from them, for example, through the system of guardianship, then where is their choice? So Article 12 is really intimately linked with Article 19. Article 14 is the right to liberty. And again, you can see how this is very closely connected to Article 19 when you look at the fact that people should not be obliged to live in a particular living arrangement. So how does that relate to Article 14, which says people should not be deprived of their liberty arbitrarily? So again, that's something that states would need to be looking at. And as I will be arguing, part of this is about ensuring that there are a range of supports that are available to people with disabilities so they can choose what's appropriate for themselves. In relation to access to community support services, Article 26, I think, is a very interesting article, and again, very closely linked to Article 19, because Article 26 talks about habilitation and rehabilitation services. And if you look at Article 26, it talks about these services being aimed at ensuring that people have the maximum independence. Similarly, Article 9, which is a crucial article because it talks about accessibility to a whole range of services and supports. Again, if you look at Article 19, it's very clear that it starts the article off by saying this is in order to enable people to live independently. So these are just examples of the other rights under the Convention, but you can see how they all link to this very important right, which is the right to live and participate in a community. So that's why I think it's in many ways you can see Article 19 reflected in many of the other rights under the Convention, but it's so important that we have this right to community living articulated in the Convention. And in fact, it's the first time this has happened. Just to say a little bit more about the close connection, this again is an extract from the Joint Committee on Human Rights report, the one I mentioned earlier that was set up in the UK. And it made this comment, which I think again is interesting for us when we're looking at these connections between rights. It said, Article 19 has been interpreted as a logical extension of the right to equal recognition before the law in Article 12 of the Convention, in the sense that recognition of legal capacity restores the power of persons with disabilities to decide about their own lives, while the right to independent living paves the way for persons with disabilities to choose how to live their lives. So again, sort of recognition of this close link. I mean, one of the reasons I feel that Article 19 is so important is because it has brought in to international human rights law this articulation of something that in many ways you think, well, isn't it obvious? This is something that all of us should have the opportunity to enjoy, this right to be in the community and participate alongside our fellow citizens. But it is important that now we do have something in a treaty that clearly articulates this important right. And it is something that isn't new, this concept. There are plenty of policies across Europe that talk about social inclusion, particularly sort of identifying the concern about the segregation of people with disabilities in institutions. But having this set out as a right, I think, is an important tool because although there are lots of policies around this, we're still seeing a reluctance on some governments, or perhaps it's just not really giving it the priority, but it's still a very, very slow process to ensure that people with disabilities are able to live in the community rather than being placed in institutions. And as I mentioned, we've got across Europe, we've got over 1 million people who are in institutions, as of today. And by articulating this right, we can then sort of say, how does this, why are we in this situation? On the one hand, You states have signed up to this important treaty, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which includes rights such as Article 19. You have got lots of lovely policies that talk about social inclusion, but where is the action to meet this concept? What are you doing to ensure that you are realising this right for people today? Because this is something that needs action now. And that's why Article 19 is so important, because we can point to that and say, this is what you should be doing. What steps are you taking to ensure that you're meeting this obligation? I mentioned that this is the first time that Article 19 has so the right to community living has been set out in a convention, but that's not to say that this is a new right. I mean, this is something that's often talked about in terms of the convention, that it doesn't make new rights. What it's doing is articulating rights in a way that's really going to promote the human rights of people with disabilities. But I've just put up for you some comments from both committees from the UN and also from the Council of Europe, that you can see that this idea of the need for governments to work towards ensuring that people with disabilities are included in the community has been talked about for many years. I'm not going to go through those points other than to say that the Standard Rules of Equalisation, which is 1993, talked about that at the UN level, and then the Council of Europe has been talking about that for a number of years, and really sort of asking member states to take action to move from institutional care to delivering services and support for people with disabilities in the community. So that's a little sort of review of Article 19. That's great, so we can have a discussion about what Article 19 means. But the really important point is, well, what action do states need to take in order to implement Article 19? And again, just to start off with, another comment from the Joint Committee on Human Rights from the UK, saying it is the nature and support, nature of the support which a person receives which determines whether somebody is able to access the Article 19 rights. A person could be living in their own home, but if they're receiving little or no support, then they will have no choice or control or freedom. Similarly, somebody who's living in a residential setting could have a package of care which enables them to live the life they choose and to be included in their community. So again, this is making the point, yes, the physical location is important, but that's not the only issue that you would need to be looking at. It's what opportunities has somebody got to live and participate in the community. So thinking about, well, okay, so we have this right, it's clearly very broad, quite a lot of obligations on states. So what's the starting point for this? And I would argue that the first point that states should make, on ratification, this does not entail a huge amount of work here. On ratification, states should formally recognise the right of people with disabilities to live in the community. They will then need to start to take effective and appropriate measures to facilitate the full enjoyment of that right, enabling people to have choices equal with others. And they also need to look at how they're going to take effective and appropriate measures to facilitate people with disabilities full participation and inclusion in the community. So sometimes I think, there's a question, well, talking about institutions, what if somebody wants to be in an institution? Is that all right? I would argue that you need to look at the definition of the institution, and perhaps we might want to do that in more detail in the discussions. But one of the things about institutions, when I'm talking about an institution, it's about the fact that somebody is segregated from society. And if you look at Article 19, it's very clear that what needs to happen is services and support need to be provided so as to avoid exclusion and segregation. So one of the things you'd be wanting to look at when somebody had the so-called choice is, well, what is that institution doing? Is it segregating someone? Because, you know, then you need to be looking at that. Is another aspect of Article 19 is enabling people to engage in mainstream services. If somebody's in an institution, have they got that opportunity? So it's really sort of digging deep into thinking about what are the systems of support, and really being able to engage in a dialogue with people to not to dismiss their questions and sort of saying, well, someone chooses to be in an institution, but really to look at, well, what are they choosing? And another important aspect is, do they actually have any choice? Is there anything else? Before going on to more detail about the implementation, I think it's important to realise that we don't look at these rights in isolation. They're very much kind of connected to each other. And I've talked about sort of the predominant rights that have links with Article 19. But then there's also aspects of the Convention that is making requirements of states in order to implement the Convention. So, for example, I've talked about raising awareness of the Convention. That is clearly a really, really important step that states need to take on ratification. In fact, they should be doing that before ratification, on signature, ensuring that people do know about this Convention, do know what their rights are. And certainly in Eastern Central Europe, one of the key questions is, well, has it been translated properly? You know, are these points sort of given in the national language in a way that accurately reflects what the actual Convention says? So that's a key issue in many parts of the world. Then, running throughout the Convention is this need to ensure that people with disabilities are actively engaged in the implementation of the Convention. So we need to look at what systems are in place so people can engage in the reforms that are necessary to make the changes to realise the rights under the Convention. And a key part of the reforms will be that states will need to look at their law, policies and practices and think, how do they meet up to these new obligations we've committed to achieving in the Convention? So there will need to be a review of national law and policy. And you know, as Michael was saying yesterday when looking at kind of the implications of Article 12, the range of areas that would be covered by Article 12, this is no small piece of work, but it does need to be started and thought through in terms of what are the laws that need to be reviewed and ensure that that review includes people with disabilities. Another aspect I think is very important for the implementation of CRPD generally, but again it's really going to be crucial for Article 19, is thinking about Article 33, the national monitoring systems that states must set up, ensuring again that people with disabilities are involved. That's something that will need to include reflection on what Article 19 is requiring and how states are taking action to meet their obligations under Article 19. So again, just to say a little bit more about Article 19 and what it means and how that impacts upon implementation. If you look at Article 19, like quite a few of the rights under the Convention, it really does challenge these conceptions that we've had in the past about the difference between civil and political rights and economic, social and cultural rights. There has in the past been a very clear split between these two sets of rights. Increasingly, it's thought that that's not particularly helpful. They are very much interlinked. And Article 19 is an example of how they are interlinked, because it encompasses rights that would be fall within the category of civil and political rights, but it also encompasses rights that fall within the category of economic, social and cultural rights. And one sort of significant aspect of these rights is that, generally speaking, civil and political rights require state action and meeting the obligations immediately, whereas economic, social and cultural rights are talked about in terms of, I think you talked about it yesterday morning, progressive realisation. So it sets out the goal that needs to be met, but recognises that not all states can immediately meet that particular right. But what is expected of the states is to ensure that they are moving towards meeting that particular right in a concrete way and ensuring that it's measuring its progress in how it's going to meet that right. So this is where you talk about indicators and benchmarks, because it's recognising that, say, the right to health, that can't be met immediately, but what it will be expected for all states, whatever the level of their resources, is that they set out a plan of action to ensure that they're going to meet those rights. And if you look at the different aspects of Article 19, you can see that there are areas where there will be that concept of progressive realisation coming in. So, for example, again, this is a comment from the Joint Committee on Human Rights. It's talked about access to a range of community-based supports and said that appears to recognise social and economic rights of disabled people. So that's where progressive realisation comes in. It then went on to say about equal access to mainstream services. That's more of a nature of a civil and political right to non-discrimination in relation to accessing goods and services, including the duty to make reasonable accommodation. But then it went on to say, but there were some things that, which in practice may have to be realised over time. So you'll see that there's a combination of rights within Article 19. So just saying a little bit more about progressive realisation, and I know you looked at this in quite a lot of detail yesterday, but it is a very, very important point for Article 19. So saying that there are the range of rights within Article 19, and we need to look at what rights should be engaged immediately, and as I said, recognising that people have the right to community living is something that needs to be done, on ratification. But there are other areas that will need to be to take time. For example, going back to the area I've mentioned, where you've got countries where for a long, long period of time the traditional so-called care is placing people in institutions. It's going to take time for governments to move from a system of institutionalisation to a range of community-based supports. So there's a recognition that will take time. But what is expected is that the states say, yes, we recognise that we need to do something, and we're going to develop an action plan to try and meet that right over the next few years. And I also mentioned the implication of resources. The fact that states do not have a huge amount of resources is never an excuse for doing nothing. So while progressive realisation, sometimes people think that that's quite a weak concept, and social and economic rights aren't as strong as civil and political rights, I would argue we just need to look at these things in a different way. The fact that you can't immediately meet a right, that is one thing, but you as a state must take action and show that you are doing the work in the best possible way, as expeditiously as you can, to meet that right. Sitting back and saying we haven't got any resources or it's all too difficult is not good enough. And that, I think, is a really important point in relation to Article 19, because it isn't necessarily an easy right to implement, and it certainly can't be in most countries implemented overnight. I've just put this, given you a slide on the right to health fact sheet, just because I thought it was quite a nice way of explaining the concept of progressive realisation. This is a fact sheet developed by the Office of the High Commission on Human Rights and the World Health Organization. So you'll see it says the concept of progressive realisation applies to all rights under the Convention. It was talking about the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Economic and social and cultural rights, and saying some would need to take immediate effect, in particular undertaking the guarantee of rights are exercised without discrimination, and then the obligation to take steps towards the realisation of the rights. And it talks about the steps of needing to be concrete, deliberate and targeted. So it's not these are not easy options. It's not saying, oh, well, we don't have to worry about economic, social and cultural rights. It's saying, no, these are important and you need to show how you're going to be meeting these rights. And another key aspect of these rights is that retrogressive measures are not permissible, save for very, very exceptional circumstances. So that's another key issue, and often quite concerned, particularly in the economic situation we are at the moment, the concern that while in some countries there has been progress, due to the cuts, it always seems that people with disabilities are of the groups that lose out because the state's saying, well, we've got to austerity, we've got to make cuts, we're all in this together. But actually, sometimes people feel, well, no, we're not all in this together. There are some groups who seem to be faring far worse than others, and that's the real fear. But again, in terms of looking at this from a human rights perspective, there are arguments that that's retrogressive, and that is not permissible under international law. So I said in terms of required action, Article 19, we're looking for explicit recognition of the right to community living. You would have thought that'd be fairly easy, but that's something that I think in some states they still struggle to do. But then it's sort of setting out the mechanisms to move towards achieving the vision of community living. So I've talked about participation and that being something very key under the Convention. So it's going to be absolutely crucial in relation to Article 19, thinking about how we're going to move forward to meet Article 19, going to be needing to ensure that people with disabilities are actively engaged in thinking through the reforms. How are we going to meet this right? And another aspect of this, and I've sort of said as much already, but it's going to be crucial for governments to set up an action plan to identify the areas in which the state is not meeting Article 19 obligations, and then say how it is going to take action to meet those obligations. Now, the Committee on the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities obviously has sort of highlighted Article 19 as an important article, and in fact it's increasingly doing so in its concluding remarks on states' periodic reports. But it sort of set out a number of things that it would be expecting states to report on in relation to Article 19. So setting out mechanisms to monitor progress, giving examples of independent living schemes, in-house support services, a range of options of residential services, and showing the degree of accessibility for people with disabilities to community services that are available to the general public. So you can see it's sort of setting up these areas where it will be expecting states to provide a report on what it's doing to meet Article 19 obligations. Just pausing a moment to think, well, yes, it's great to have this vision, and ideally states are working away as we speak to think about how are they going to meet Article 19 obligations. But there are clearly many barriers to meeting this. And I've just sort of set out a few here as examples. So I think we've touched on guardianship. Yesterday there was mention of guardianship, and I should just say, again, just talking from a perspective of what happens in Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, there is a very pervasive form, in many countries, a very pervasive form of guardianship, where somebody who is deemed to lack capacity, just on grounds that they have a form of mental disorder, and then basically all their rights are taken away because another person has been appointed to make decisions for them. Irrespective of whether they could actually make those decisions themselves, they're just assumed not to be able to make any decisions whatsoever. So in some countries, guardians are agreeing to the person being placed in an institution, and that's considered in their domestic law as that's voluntary admission because the guardian has agreed to it, irrespective of what the individual's views are. Again, there are countries where, in reality, the only so-called care is being placed in an institution. So in many cases, it seems that people don't have any choice but to place their relative in an institution, or there's no information about the alternatives. So these are really major barriers to this idea that people have an equal choice on their living arrangements. Access to community services, already mentioned that in some cases there are very few community services, but there are also, when trying to create alternatives to institutions, you then meet other barriers. The state, the government isn't up for something other than an institution. So non-governmental organisations who are seeking to develop alternatives then find that there are all sorts of bureaucratic restrictions on them doing so. And there may be a law that says only an institution can provide the services, or there may be difficulties in someone getting funding for developing these services. So these are very real and substantial barriers to meeting Article 19 obligations. And then in relation to access to mainstream services, now clearly this is going to vary from country to country, but again in some countries it's probably due to discrimination, or this doesn't happen. You don't have people with disabilities in the community, so of course they're not going to be engaged in services for the public. So there's a lot of discrimination. That means that it's either never even contemplated, or, well, it's not going to happen, it's prohibited. So equal access to mainstream services is another area where we have to look at what are the barriers to people with disabilities enjoying this part of Article 19. And I've talked a lot about the institutionalisation of people with disabilities, but clearly that is a major barrier. I mean, it seems to me that people do not have Article 19 rights if they are segregated in an institution, where countless reports have identified numerous severe human rights abuses of residents. And unfortunately, in some cases, governments think the way to cure that is to make the institutions better, rather than to say institutionalisation in itself is contrary to Article 19. Now, I'm saying that quite confidently, but with the knowledge that if you look at Article 19, you won't see any reference to institutions, nor indeed will you see any reference to closing in the institution. But I would argue that it is implicit in Article 19 that institutions have to be closed. Because if you look at the way we've just been talking about, access to mainstream services, access to a range of community-based supports, they're not available in institutions. And you also look at Article 19, which is saying that the services and support should be directed to avoiding isolation and segregation. That is what an institution does. So, I'm sure there are lots of reasons why Article 19 doesn't refer to the closure of institutions, but as I said, the reading of Article 19 makes clear that they do not have any role in a world that respects Article 19. And just quickly moving on, I mean, this is something that the fact sheet on the right to health mentioned in terms of saying people who are locked up in institutions simply on the basis of a disability, has serious repercussions on health, actually has serious repercussions on a wide range of human rights. So I'll just leave that part for you. What I want to get on to is thinking a little bit about implementing Article 19. Now, what I've got up here for you is a checklist that I was involved in developing for the Open Society Mental Health Initiative, which works in Eastern and Central Europe and the former Soviet Union to promote community living. And what we were doing, we were looking at Article 19 and thinking, well, what does that mean in terms of implementation for countries where the predominant form of care is still institutionalisation? So that's where it's this checklist is directed. But I would hope that some of the points would be as relevant for other countries where institutionalisation is a thing of the past, but still there's lots of work to be done to realise Article 19. So you see, sort of the first one is commit to transforming the system from institutional care to community-based services. And then this explicit recognition of the right to community living. So those are very, very much specific to moving from institutional care to community-based services, as indeed is point 3, which is setting up a national strategy to do that. But then I think of general application would be the requirement to set up mechanisms to enable the participation of people with disabilities to engage in the reforms that will be required. It was suggested, and again this is probably sort of more in relation to this recognition that moving from institutional care to community-based services is quite a big job. So it's suggested that we should sort of develop links with experts, but not just international experts, have experts within the country itself. So to engage with people who can give ideas about how to make this transition from institutional care to community-based services. But equally, even in countries where you don't have institutions, I think having experts, and I think a lot of the experts would be people with disabilities who know about how to promote independent living and community living, what that means, what that looks like, and really making the point that what we should be directed about is what people want to receive, what they think is going to help them to engage in community life. So they're the sort of first initial points, and then it's sort of the next part is steps for implementation. And we need to look at the range of legislation that impacts upon Article 19. And as with Article 12, it won't be small. You might start off with a few obvious ones, but as you look beyond that, you'll be thinking there's a lot of legislation that we need to look at, because part of the issue that we need to be addressing is what are the barriers that prevent people from enjoying this right. Then the review of the existing services. That's going to be really important. It's going to be part of the process of finding out, well, what do we need to do? Where are we failing to meet Article 19? Okay, so you need to be looking at what is in existence at the moment. And then the ensuring transparency of public funds. Again, this perhaps is sort of comes from work in Eastern and Central Europe, where there's concerns that European money has been used to build new institutions or renovate existing institutions rather than develop the alternatives. So that's where that point comes from, but I suspect it's actually quite an important point to have in any country when we're needing to know how are we using our money to meet these obligations, and that should be information that's accessible to anyone with an interest in it. Data collection is going to be really important. What services do we need? You need to have an idea about the population, how governments need to think about what services that need to be provided, where and who for. And all of that will require a periodic review. And this goes back to my initial comments about recognising that, as with Article 12, what we're looking at is a vision that I suspect that no country meets all the requirements under Article 19. There are clearly countries that I've referred to that are way behind others, but I suspect there's not one country that can say tick to every aspect of Article 19. So all countries are going to need to have a plan, and all countries are going to need to review that plan, because, as I was saying, the important thing is that we have a goal, and then we measure what we are doing, how are we doing to meet that goal. And that requires constant review and dialogue with others to ensure that we are going in the right direction and we are doing things in the right way. So just to pick out a few points that I think are worth exploring a bit more. The first one is this developing a national strategy, and this, I think, is something that has been mentioned by a number of organisations. So the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, in its analysis of the Convention, talked about Article 19, and you can see here it says, countries will in most cases need to develop a national strategy that integrates the range of areas such as social services, health, housing, and employment. The Debt Clock report, that is a report that was produced in Europe, and it relates to deinstitutionalisation and community living, and looks at outcome and costs. And it had a bit of economic analysis, but it also had an analysis of the situation in the EU member states, sort of identifying how many people were in institutions and sort of how kind of the makeup of those institutions, and that's where this figure of 1.2 million comes from. And in that report, there were a range of recommendations to governments on how they might move from institutions to community-based services. So again, you'll see this idea about having a national mandate for the transition, set up plans to close institutions, have a vision of what we're trying to achieve. And that would clearly require consultation with people with disabilities and their families. So, many of the organisations and individuals who've been looking at this issue, you can see are saying very, very similar things. The concern sometimes is that governments aren't quite hearing that message. I mentioned about participation for people with disabilities, and that is something that is a core theme of the Convention, but again, it's going to be really, really important for the implementation of Article 19. And part of this would be about the vision. What is the vision? What do people want? How are we going to achieve that? So that's the crucial dialogue that needs to be had with a whole range of stakeholders, but very much at the centre are people with disabilities themselves. But then also the ongoing review of what are we doing, how are we meeting our aspirations, are we meeting the indicators and the benchmarks. And the other aspect would be that while we're making the transition, if we are in a country where we need to make that transition from institutional care to community-based services, people with disabilities need to be involved in reviewing those services. And that's going to be as important for community-based services as it is for institutional care. Again, this goes back to my point about the physical location is a factor, but it's not the only one. There is a danger that unless Article 19 obligations and expectations are embraced by community-based services, what would happen is that we simply create mini institutions. So there needs to be work to ensure that we don't create a culture of institutionalisation within smaller community services. And one great way of doing that would be for people with disabilities to go to those services and to give their views on how those services are doing and whether they are respectful for of the rights of people receiving those services. So this is something that I think really, one of my messages is this is not going to stop. This is an ongoing situation in order to ensure that Article 19 is met, and that is going to require the engagement of people who are going to be using those services as much as others who are involved in delivering those services. The review of legislation and policies, being a lawyer and a policy person myself, I would say this is quite a crucial area. But it is something that, as I said, reflecting on the comments on Article 12, this is not a small piece of work. And again, it's not going to be something that can be done and just finished. It will be something that needs to be constantly reviewed. But I've given for you some examples of areas that would need to be looked at, and I'm not for a moment suggesting that this is the only thing that would be on the list. The list would be quite long. But we'd need to think about how we can ensure that legislation and the financing mechanisms enable people to access the supports that they require. We need to look at decision-making, and I've put guardianship laws, but actually I think, again, reflecting on yesterday's discussion, it goes much wider than that. How are we going to enable people, the law to reflect that people have a right to make decisions for themselves and receive the support that they need to do so? So that's a big aspect of this work, and as I said, clearly links in with Article 12. There's a link to guardianship, but it's broader than that. There's a whole concept of involuntary admission. What's the legislation? Does it comply with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities? How are we going to make it comply if it doesn't? So that's a huge piece of work. And again, Michael was talking about mental health law, and that's sort of an area that needs to be included in these discussions, and because it's such an important issue. We need to be thinking about how institutions and actually community-based services are monitored. And within that, I've put the handling of complaints. Complaints are really, really important, and enabling people to make complaints is something that's absolutely crucial for services to always learn from what people think about their services. But the reality is that often people who are receiving services will, quite frankly, be scared to make complaints about the services that are receiving because they fear that that will have repercussions for them. So there's, even within complaints, there's a whole range of things that would need to be looked at to ensure that people are able to make complaints and those complaints are taken seriously. And then another huge raft that would need to be looked at is issues around challenging social exclusion, which partly covers introducing non-discrimination law, but again would be looking at the range of laws and policies to really do a check on, are they creating barriers for people living in the community as equal citizens? So, as I said, this is a huge piece of work, but it is only one factor of the work that needs to be carried out to implement Article 19. And then I've just mentioned the review of services and again sort of made a few comments. So it'd be thinking about what kind of services are being delivered and ensuring that people not only have access to services that are geared towards providing them with the support, but also thinking about access to mainstream services and ensure that people with disabilities have access to those services that everyone else is able to use. So that was my review of Article 19 and some ideas on implementation.
Great. Thanks.